Welcome, everyone. Hello, hello. Welcome. So glad to have you here. Feel free to put in the chat where you're joining us from. And if you'd like to connect with others, add your LinkedIn. We always love to see that. We encourage this space of networking and connection as part of this extension to what CHIPS is really about the people. And we really appreciate you showing up here for this incredible conversation. I'm Monica Phillips. I'm the Director of Learning Content and Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at CHIPS. CHIPS' mission is to advance women in tech law and policy. And I'm really thrilled for this conversation today with Olga Mack and Adrienne Go. This is so much more than a book launch. This is really about reimagining how lawyers come together at the intersection of technology, law, and business in an AI-powered innovation first world. When I spoke to Olga a few months ago, we went for a walk. She talked to me about Product Counsel and the book that she and Adrienne had co-authored. And I was so excited about this opportunity, really leaning into this learning and leading part of CHIPS in how we can show up and support each other to really advance how we come together as a profession in the legal industry. So again, put in the chat where you're joining us from, your LinkedIn if you want to connect with others. And with that, I would love to turn it over to Olga and Adrienne, and I'll have them introduce themselves. Thank you for being here with us.
Sure, I can go first. Again, I'm Adrienne Go. What a lovely introduction, Monica. Thank you very much. And thank you to the CHIPS team. I don't know, but I am so happy to be here. I've admired CHIPS for a long time, and I'm particularly excited to be here because I have a tremendous amount of respect for the organization and my IP partners. And I have also, of course, a bit of humility because in many ways, intellectual property and those of you who are practitioners are really the OG of product counseling. So I did not go to law school with the intention of becoming an e-commerce expert or someone who could work side by sides with engineers at a whiteboard. But in fact, I was just telling the team, I was raised in a really small town in the Central Valley, and I didn't know any lawyers when I was growing up. So I didn't know what they did outside of going to court, like on TV. So, but that said, I did make my way to law school and kind of did the whole big firm lawyering thing. But get this, so I started my career as a real estate lawyer, like doing deals and leases. And I'm sharing this with you so that you can imagine a world where everybody has an opportunity to flex and to probe into lawyering opportunities. I leveraged my experience as a deal lawyer actually, I became a public sector lawyer. I was like a government lawyer. I worked at the San Francisco International Airport. I did concessions, airline agreements, and I was there for 9/11. A few years later, I saw this really cool position on some job board. I don't even remember what it was, but it was a role with eBay. So eBay has been around for quite a long time. But at the time that I joined, it was still very much a baby company. And I was already a big fan of the company. So pro tip, find roles and projects that you're interested in. The business was still young at the time, but very groundbreaking, very exciting. I've since joined another company, but today I really hope to share with you some of the things I think about in terms of the what lawyering can do for companies and products and what the future holds. So thank you for that opportunity to introduce myself.
Well, hello everyone. Really excited to be at CHIPS today. CHIPS has been an important part of my career. I've been a member, I'd like to believe from the beginning, and if not from the very, very beginning, shortly after. So I grew up in CHIPS. I've attended various conferences, I've spoken at them. I've met many of you, and many of you are in my network, and many of you I consider my friends. So I'm really excited to be among friends. I am proudly an IP lawyer, trained by design. I went to law school to be an IP lawyer. I thought I may enjoy other areas of law. I kind of persevered through them to be able to practice law. I love IP so much that I joke that I was in my copyright, trademark, trade secrets, and patent classes, and there was this guy who was in every class. And I told him that basically we're already dating. You just don't know it yet. He's the guy I married. So to say that I love IP is an understatement. It's really a big part of my life, and that's what I essentially married. But most importantly, For me, it's been a very important part of my career. I'm really grateful for an opportunity to be an IP lawyer, and it has been an instrumental part of my career, growing at a law firm, then in house. I've been at Visa Inc., then becoming general counsel at a few pre-IPO companies, eventually become a CEO of legal tech companies. Most recently, I've joined Term Scout, which helps to accelerate revenue by certifying contracts. So, in my view, the skills you learn as an IP lawyer really are the skills you need to be a leader of whatever definition you have. And the reason Adrienne and I have written this book is because we think that the very closely related product counseling skill is really a core skill that positions you for leadership and impact because, unlike everything else in law, it actually positions you very closely with the business. It like literally aligns you to why businesses exist. And I think one of the reasons I wanted to write this book is because I'm absolutely grateful for the intellectual property skills, related product counseling skills, because I think they absolutely helped me to be a good lawyer and leader and general counsel, and frankly, the most useful thing I've done in the last 20 years to become a CEO of company as well.
I love what you said, Olga, about product law being why the business exists. And that's why I wanted to have this conversation because we're all about elevating and advancing the lawyer as a business partner. So, Adrienne, let's start with the basics. Tell us more. What is product law? You're known for being an expert in this area. How would you define it?
Well, the good news is that product counseling is a bit amorphous, but at its core, product counsel are lawyers who work side by side with product engineering and business teams. They're kind of at that intersection where you know you've got a customer problem, whether they need a better ride sharing app or whether they need a biomedical device. You know your customers need and want something, and you got to figure out how to deliver that. So it's generally working side by side with the business people to think about the strategy, the customer base, the need. Work with your product teams and your engineer teams to think about what you're going to build, how you're going to solve for that problem, and of course you bring your lawyering expertise to bear on that. And if you do it right, you are an integral part of the product lifecycle, everything from the ideation stage at the beginning when you're starting to think about it, all the way to the end of launch and thereafter. And to be clear, products can include any kind of good or service, everything from an insurance program to an e-commerce platform to a biomedical device to a new bicycle or violin. And of course, these days, all of these products are going to be looking to emerging technology to think about how to get better and how to really power both like our goods economy, and our society. So it's very much about being the go-to lawyer for the product.
Thank you. So, with that foundation, Olga, you're a visionary for thinking about what law does for our world. How would you add to that?
um, I think the big aha moment for me was when I realized that everything we ship has law baked in. It's not a choice. The question is, are we intentional about it? And I think that's sort of a really big realization that baked in legal part is very important, and doing so intentionally make aligns you with operations of the business and sort of its ability to succeed. And you can just tell organizations where law is an afterthought versus it is sort of part of the infrastructure and how they do business. And it doesn't even have to be, it doesn't even have to backfire to know that it is an afterthought. You've been in companies where, when legal is involved, a tad too late, you are basically doing a cleanup job. You're delivering bad news after another. you're stuck in the cycle and likely wondering why did I choose this job? Um, and if you are involved early in every stage of a product life cycle, and I do think that anchoring your actions in the product life cycle, how you talk, what you do, what you give throughout that life cycle changes because the risks of a product actually evolve as the product, goes from inception, ideation, build, test, taking to markets, growing, scaling, and sunsetting. Those, if you are very intentional in positioning yourself on that life cycle, then you can answer a better operational question that aligns you with the business of adding value. And especially in high growth environments where speed and trust are everything. But frankly, today in every environment, speed and trust is everything because everyone is moving pretty fast, not just startups. That is where lawyers who are involved throughout product life cycles, who understand risks, how they change, and deeply involved with the operation of the business. This is where product counsel, especially intellectual uh, uh, property lawyers, in the age of technology can really provide quite a lot of value and bake in practices that long term really create a lot of ROI for the company.
Adrienne, give us an example of what this looks like in everyday life.
Oh, such a good example. In fact, I'm living it every day. So I think about this a lot because when I first started this kind of lawyering, I was still like operating like a law firm lawyer would operate, where someone comes to me, they have a question, and I need to do a, encyclopedic research project around it and produce a 50-page memo on all the possible laws and risks that are associated with it. And I've gotten, especially working with Olga and working with specialty lawyers like IP lawyers, I've gotten much better at understanding how to be the most effective lawyer at every stage of the life cycle. So let me give you an example of how I would think about the level of my advice at every stage of the product life cycle. And then I'll share with you kind of how it all comes together in a particular product. So if you think about it at the very beginning, you've got like, business people and maybe a product manager in a room, and they're thinking about like, what do we want to build? What we want to do next year to achieve our strategy? Whether it be we want a better, hip replacement device, or whether we want to build a new bicycle. What is it that we think we need to do to solve our customer problem? What does that customer problem look like? Are they looking to ride across town, or do they need foldable bicycles? What is their biggest frustrations? What does our user feedback say? You start with your customer. What does that society look like? What do they need? What does our competitive landscape look like? That's called the ideation stage. And you start brainstorming at that stage about what we might build in terms of a product to solve that customer problem. So that's where I thought we had to give like a complete answer on all possible quote unquote risks. And it turns out that that's probably not the stage yet where you need to do that. And so I've worked to get better at this, and I've helped my team get better at this, to use that opportunity to really get an understanding of what they're thinking about. And remember, this is a brainstorming ideation stage. Give them a preview of what the kind of the big picture complexity might look like. Again, this is not the time where you do a 50-page survey. It's a time where you say, oh, okay, you want to go into gift cards. Let's work with you closely on that, because gift cards are regulated state by state. And there's some little bit of nuances there. And it isn't difficult, but it might take time. Give them a preview of complexity and time. But most importantly, before you do that, give them your support and enthusiasm, because that's where you're going to build trust. They're really trying to solve your customer problem, and you can become part of the team to figure out how to solve that customer problem. The next stage would be a design and development stage. Again, that's where you're really doing some hard lawyering. You're looking at proposed designs, understanding how do they want to create a really elegant solution for the customers. You might want to be looking at product safety, both digital and hard goods. At this point, I'm going to be turning to my IP friends and saying, let's talk a little bit about, at the development stage, about patentability and open source and incorporation of other people's, making sure we have the licensing rights and things like that. When you're gearing up to go to market, you really want to be very, very thoughtful about making sure that you are promoting a very successful launch and making sure that that's positioned, in accordance with all the kinds of strong and powerful, compelling marketing claims that we all want as lawyers and as marketing professionals. Growing in scale, you've got a project, you've launched it, you want to grow it, you want to expand functionality, you want to take it around the world. Again, lawyers have a great opportunity there to get the product ready to do that, to scale across features and across the world. And then finally, there comes a time at deprecation or sunsetting when maybe the product needs to be deprecated, you replace it with a new model or similar. And shockingly, the lawyers also have a tremendous role to play there, thinking about what how do you handle customer care? How do you migrate the tech? And so all of those lawyers, if they think about the product life cycle, they think about, what do I need to do at this stage? Who do I need to talk to? And what can I give them to best add value? That's how I think about the product life cycle.
Thanks. Olga, I love what you said about being intentional. And I think that's so important to keep in mind when you see that IP isn't integrated into the process early enough. What are some things that can go wrong?
Yeah, you know, I I I remember thinking in law school in IP, do I like the intellectual part better or the property part better? And I kind of think it's a really interesting question to ask. And I'm yet to pick a favorite. I guess maybe that's my answer. But it's important to kind of focus, I think, on the property part of it. Property is, they create values. They create differentiation. They create portfolios. They create deals. They create money. And I think that that's sort of at the core of what it means to be an IP lawyer. And frankly, because IP is such a big part of product counseling. And so really, I think you are leaving value on the table when you are building blind and when you are not including IP advice throughout the life cycle. And so I am of a strong belief that that's very, very important. So for example, you're very likely to miss competitive differentiation. You might be first to market, but if you don't protect your product or what's unique about it, you get some quick replications in the market. People can outspend you. It's not unusual to be outspent. People can be more clever. They have resources. And so that's a real loss. I see it all the time. I think the second thing I see all the time is like really weak patent portfolios or intellectual property portfolios. Filing after launch means you often documenting, compromises as opposed to sort of core innovations. And so it's a real loss to the company. You lose leverage. IP creates value by, in all kinds of business milestones, from fundraising to partnerships to M&A. Understanding how whatever you create, in intellectual property will impact that is important. And if you miss the part of creation in time for valuation, that's a real loss. So all of that to say, reflect on both words. And I would say the early part really goes into that strategy and ability to leverage property, which is the only reason to have it. Really, it's not a collectible item, really, to get real value out of your sweat of the brow, so to speak.
I have a lot of really good friends who are head of legal, head of IP, head of commercial, and they've told me stories about partnering with sales, partnering with products, partnering with the CEO. And there's this sense like the lawyer walks in the room and everyone's like, what's wrong? Right. And they're not partnering with them early enough, or they're not being included in the meetings. And there are many cases where the lawyers don't have a seat at the table. Adrienne, this is kind of part of your origin story. I'd love to hear you talk more about why that matters and how the lawyer as business person can be this crucial partner for the success of the business.
Oh, I love this question. And like I said, I just joined a new company and I'm experiencing the same thing, learning an opportunity to build relationships and to build trust. And so I will start with when I first joined eBay, it was a 10-year-old company at the time, but it had incredible um, uh, initiatives underway. It was an incredible platform already. Um, and there was a very, very strong legal team, and they were specializing in areas such as litigation, and there was a patent team. In fact, some very strong patent people. I think they're very close to Chips here. Um, there was some privacy folks, but they were very focused on their specialty areas. They had ambitious plans, but there were no dedicated lawyers that were advising the product and tech teams. And at the time, the product and tech teams were taking a much bigger lead in deciding what are we going to build, how are we going to build it, what customers is this going to face. And so the challenge for me is trying to understand, like, so much of our value was driven by our user experience. What does our website look like? What do the programs look like? Do the buyers trust the platform? Do the sellers want to sell on the platform? So I decided that I wanted to figure out whether we could get closer to that organization and give them advice earlier, because everybody knows there is nothing worse than throwing a red flag the day before launch. You find out about it, you put up the big stop sign, everyone hates you, everyone's disappointed, goals are blown, no one wants to invite you to the party anymore because you are now the naysayer and the party pooper. So I decided to get involved earlier, but I didn't know how to do it. So I started really small. I grabbed one of my friends, a guy named Braden Dong, on the legal team, and we just started like inviting ourselves to meetings, finding out who's doing what. And to be honest, when we walked into these meetings, like, they did not know what to do with us. They had never seen lawyers actually join the meetings. They were worried. They thought we were going to crush their dreams. They thought they were in trouble. Um, and they certainly did not understand the law. And they were very worried. So I had to start from that, of being the realization, the stark realization that it wasn't that I was unwelcome, but I, I, I was like a bit of a misfit toy in the room. So I started slow, and I realized that I really had to build relationships with these folks. And that really means building a trusted relationships. And that involves things like getting super practical, understanding your business. I think we can talk about this a little bit more later about the how to build that trust. But if you walk in and you start by spouting the law, it's probably not going to land as well as if you start with building the trust, understanding like what their goals are, how they're trying to solve the customer problem. What does the tech stack allow? What is their timeline? Who does what? Who makes decisions? All of those things is a series of questions rather than a legal memo. And once you build that foundation, you have a much better place of trust and can give the most practical advice possible. So you too can be that kind of lawyer.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Olga, you talked about creating conversations where you go from the business leaders evolve from not wanting you in the conversation to not being able to imagine not having you part of every conversation. Can you tell us a little more and talk about specifically a strategy you use to make yourself essential?
Yeah, I had this moment once in the boardroom where a CEO was calling me Harvey. And he called it once and I sort of ignored it. He called me twice and I was like, what's wrong with him? And he called me a third time and I was like, my name is Olga. Who the hell is Harvey? And he was like, oh, it's the guy from the show. Full disclosure, I don't watch TV. I actually don't like TV very much. This is when I became a fan of Suits because my CEO was watching it, fascinated by it. And I sort of realized that that was a compliment to be compared to this, middle-aged white dude. And I kind of thought about it, and then since then, when I speak, I usually ask people, especially women, especially women of color, close your eyes. Imagine you have the worst legal problem, like whatever, pick your choice, whether it's criminal or tax, whatever your flavor. And now imagine who comes to your rescue. Imagine that person very vividly. And I guarantee you, for most people, it won't be a girl named Olga. And I'd like you to reflect on that moment. Um, and that's where I start every time. And maybe that's where you start too every time. But that's not where you have to end. And I don't know how I think Mr. Spencer is handsome. And I would even, if I weren't married, consider marrying him. But I certainly as heck don't want to be him. And And so every time I walk in a room, realizing that I'm not a lawyer in their mind and terrified becoming Mr. Spencer, I ask myself, how are we going to bridge the gap where you can't imagine me as your lawyer or your CEO or whatever power seat you imagine. But at some point, I want to make sure that you can't imagine life without me anyway, which I think that calling me Harvey basically what it implied. And I think that pausing and thinking through that, how do I show up as myself without diluting myself, still being impactful, and tickle that person's imagination and help them imagine better and get on the same page. And what I find very important is to use the right words. So, for example, I find that the word revenue really helps you get people's attention. And I actually kind of experienced it as a CEO. I had a bunch of reports. Some of them were talking to me about money, and they became my favorite executives, even if I didn't like their personality. I don't know how to explain it. But it was like revenue is the juiciest thing you could ever talk to me as a CEO. Like you immediately got my attention, like full attention. And I like had questions and I was engaged. And if you were talking about risks, I think I was and I'm a risk wired lawyer. So you would think I care more about it. So, and every risk conversation can be leveraged into revenue conversations. And you have to be really intentional about those words. For example, things like compliance. That is not a word that really gets a lot of sort of like, I'm excited to have this conversation with you. But things like sticky product, that's where you get attention. Or upside, like business people love words upside. Um, IP protection, I found that I have very little audience on that. But leverage, when I speak leverage, they want to be my best friends. I mean, and I can go on. I actually have lists of words that I intentionally swap when I talk about the same thing. I think if you walk into a room with intention to be yourself, I mean, if you want to be Mr. Spencer, that's fine. I will not judge you. But if you want to be yourself at the core and help them imagine, I find that this intentional one or two or three words, saying few things and saying it in their language, they will follow you. You will be their best friend. They will go from I couldn't imagine you to I can't imagine being without you.
Are those words in the book? Fantastic. You could add an addendum. Yeah. This is great. So it was so drawn and I forgot what I was going to ask next, but I really think it's so important to have that. I wanted to know because we didn't talk about this, but have either of you had an experience where someone asked you to do something that was really demeaning? And how did you handle that? And I'm picturing the scene in Legally Blonde when she's asked to get the coffee constantly, right? And so maybe you haven't been asked to get the coffee, but have you been put in a position where you were asked to do something that really would have put you in a role that wouldn't have been right for you or would have taken away from the power dynamics in the room? And how did you handle that?
I have to admit that it definitely happened to me like multiple times earlier in my career. And I did have the benefit of being at a big company the past, 10 plus years where I had worked very hard. And maybe because of the training I had as an earlier lawyer of really defining my role, my skills, my added value, and my brand. And I don't mean like, oh, I have to have a celebrity, brand that has no substance behind it. I mean, but really making sure that people understood how much value I could add. Believe me, I had zero concerns with being the person to, proofread a PowerPoint deck or something like that. But it truthfully, and I also have no problems with, trying to make sure everybody has coffee. But I think but for the past 10 years or so, I had the benefit of having been at my company for a while. And already, and my name is pretty memorable. And if you meet me in person, my presence is pretty memorable, thankfully. So I do think that I've avoided most of that. But as a petite woman of color in my early days, 100%, especially if I was wearing, you know, particular colors that looked like I would be wait staff. I definitely had those experiences. And I guess my encouragement, and I would love for Olga's thoughts on this, was we all have an opportunity to forgive and embrace graciously for all kinds of societal interactions. And we also have the opportunity to make our own way. And I encourage people to move forward with intention, appreciation of the context, and with grace.
Yeah, I'll make an observation that when somebody makes a comment, it's going to be slightly different response than what Adrienne shared. When somebody shares something about you that you cannot change, for example, you are too intellectual property, or you are too, experienced, or you are not experienced enough. Um, or whatever that you cannot change. That's not feedback. It's like saying you're too tall. Well, thank you. You're too short. Like those are not useful things. I do think that when we get this kind of feedback, we sort of stop and say, "What's wrong with it? How can I change?" And I would invite you to reflect on that and think about this is a feedback that meant to stop you from your destination because it's actually not useful. Like, what do you do with you're too tall or too experienced? Like, you can't change that. And so I guess maybe one thing I would say is that you get stuff, it's an easy way to get rid of somebody, but it's actually not helpful to you. And I will invite you that sometimes you hear stuff that is pure garbage. And that's example of pure garbage. The appropriate thing to do with pure garbage is to throw it away, not to think too deeply, not to change yourself, but return to the sender, and do so very intentionally. Ask yourself, whoever gave you that feedback, if they really truly cared about you, like, do they even know you, right? And so you don't have to be spicy about it. I actually find that my silence sometimes, like with like a tad longer stare, speaks everything. And it's the most powerful statement I will ever make. It will never be forgotten. And I do that probably now that I've matured a little bit more often than I used to when I was younger. Like at some point, somebody said, "Oh, Olga is just a lawyer." I was younger. I emphatically said, "Well, a peacock is just a bird, but what a bird it is." I could have just stared. I had a really good time answering that statement. Okay. I
And you're never just anything, Olga.
and so it just you have a choice. I now tend to do 9 out of 10 times stare, but I used to say things. So I was interviewed for an online dating company job, which I really wanted. The product manager said, "Well, what do you know about dating? You've been married." And I said, "What I know about dating is how to source the dates, how to select one, and how to close the deal and how to keep it closed. Do you know how to do that?" He was single. So I said, "I think I'm qualified." Oh, I could have been nice about it, but I actually kind of wanted to have fun with it. And I was spicier at the time. That was the kind of the mood I was in. Anyway, I would just say, reflecting on what comes your way, a lot of it is garbage. Feel free to send it back. You don't have to say anything. Your silence will speak louder. And if you want to show up as a spicy self you are sometimes, you'll have great stories to tell when you speak.
I love it. I'm going to switch gears a little bit. I do want to come back to trust, Adrienne, but I want to talk about this. We have some members in CHIPS who are first-time GCs at high velocity pre-IPO startups. We have some senior leaders, some here on the call, and I'd love to hear at what point does someone bring on a dedicated product counsel, and how do you think about bringing in that role and what that relationship looks like in building the legal team? Olga, do you want to start?
Sure. I'm happy to talk about it. Um, look, I mean, as I alluded before, speed is oxygen. It always has been in startups. I actually think it's increasingly true in every company. It is, we are going through a lot of transitions and changes and transformations. Some of them are pretty big. And, it is true that with every massive change, statistically speaking, the bad news about 20% of the population, whether it's companies or people, basically will not survive that profession or a career or that business. That's the bad news. The good news is that about 7% will do even better. They will significantly up level and do better, and then everybody else will sort of stay the same. And so, speed is important, and especially in early stage companies. And you, as a leader, and I actually think everybody in the legal department is a leader because they're so leanly staffed. You almost never have two lawyers on the same meeting. So independent of how junior or senior your title is, you are absolutely a leader. And so you have a choice in every interaction, whether you positioning company to die, to do better, or stay the same. And I actually, like reflect into going into every conversation, like, what am I gonna do to make sure that I uplift them and give them more than their current trajectory? And so this ability to balance speed with foresight and being proactive is very important. If you are in the early stage company, you are doing something that has not been done before. Because if it has been done before, and it would be easy, it would have been already done before. And so if you're finding yourself, hearing things like, "We already built it. Can you look at it? Can you take a quick look at it?" Or, you're finding out that the launch is tomorrow. Like, and that happens not just once, but maybe twice a quarter. Yeah, you probably need to bring product counsel. Also, I would say the second part is, if you're building, and increasingly we are building in highly regulated areas, like think you fintech, for example. In those areas, bringing somebody who understands sort of the the regulations related to those products, especially if you as a leader are not native to those conversations for whatever reasons, I would say that's when you should consider, bringing a dedicated product counsel. And then maybe I'll alert to the third one. We tend to think that product conversations are kind of more in a technology stack, but actually they are often increasingly in UX, in UI, basically whatever customer touches. And so that button, that toggle, that dark pattern that you have, those are actually what customers notice. And so if you have a lot of features and a lot of things that people kind of touch, virtually or in real life, you as leaders should be considering that there's lots of risks in every button and in every sort of interaction. So those are probably three flags that I would actively watch and keep an eye on as a legal leader, thinking through at what point do I bring a specialist.
Thank
And if I
you.
can just add a little bit of color to that, Monica, if you give me a bit here. And this is where we transition from being lawyers to legal partners. It's not just looking at the user interface or the user experience for risks and things we want to manage, but like put your business hat on. This is the opportunity to be creative and figure out, could we do something that's even more compelling here? Do we have an idea to make it, to add less friction to the experience or to make something more compelling? Or maybe there was something left over in the legacy app experience that somehow somebody thought about it 5 years ago, it had to be there. Do we have an opportunity to remove it or to add to it or make it even more interesting for the customer, so that at the end of the day, if you're doing it right, the lawyers are not just speaking the law, but they're using their understanding of the law to make the customer experience better, which will make my CEO friend Olga happier, because you can say revenues are up.
That's the magic word.
Revenue is a very juicy word. I mean, if you have a pet and your pet likes a certain treat, like you get it to have a better connection. Why wouldn't you use the same with your I mean, don't treat your CEO as pets, but but that could be a better relationship if you give water to thirsty and food to hungry. And revenue is definitely that very satisfying word, leverage, like all of those words are just so much more juicy and satisfying.
I like the word nourishment too, but that's a different that's a different conversation. The role of product counsel is a natural evolution of the IP lawyers who already straddle law, tech, and business. And I love this idea. Even in the CHIPS community, we have built a platform of about 8,000 members who are really focused on tech law and policy. And so it really is this intersection of all of these dynamic energies that drive revenue that lead us to be that business partner. So, Adrienne, tell us more about how IP lawyers are already leaning into this, and maybe there's just for some, it's just a subtle shift to make that leap into product counsel, or maybe it's just an expansion or awareness or an intention, like Olga said, of how to create and partner with the business.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So good news, everybody. If you are an IP lawyer, good news, you are already a product lawyer. And if you're the only lawyer for your company, you are also a product lawyer. You may not have that in your title, but at the end of the day, you are very much thinking about what you're offering to your customers, whether in a B2B environment or a B2C environment, what goes into it, how it's presented, how you build it, what rights of others are in it. So you're already starting to think about the product. If you wanted to be like thinking about like, could I move into more broader view of product counseling? Absolutely. A couple of like super practical tips, depending on the size of your company. Move toward the fire is what I would recommend, and that means actually being really proactive. Find out where decisions are being made in the product life cycle, whether it be at the ideation stage, the strategy stage, the product, the roadmap deciding stage. Move as close as you can to that, so you can get get closer to the kind of the broader view of what they're building, what strategies they're trying to solve. Find out where the decisions are being made, and learn more about the product life cycle. At what stage do we launch? Do we actually have a formal 5-stage, 8-stage product life cycle, or is it a startup where you think about it one day and you start building it the next day? Find out like how it works, get your foundation sorted out, and then start building those relationships we talked about and asking questions. And when I say asking questions, I don't watch Suits, but we want to avoid the questions of, you know, uh, did we substantiate that? Okay, that's a great question. It is probably not the most meaningful to a product manager or engineer, but really start with like these really open-ended questions, and you can use your IP, uh, your IP title, if you will, to start that conversation. We know, for example, all of my patent lawyer friends out there are very much tuning into what is the technology all about, what does the product do, how does it work. They're using a very sophisticated brain to translate that into a claims analysis. But if you have that like trusted relationship, and I mean like actually taking people to coffee and things like that, virtual or in person, like they're usually delighted to tell you about the product. How does it work? What customers are we trying to serve? Who makes the decisions about this? Do you see any problems on your roadmap? How are we going to use this innovation? That would be the second thing I would encourage is to get closer to the fire on the product life cycle. And then the third thing I would think about is go ahead and try to think about yourself not as a IP lawyer, but as a company lawyer or a firm lawyer who's going to specialize in building a great business. And so, if you start looking to your left and looking to your right and you see a contract issue, you see an AI issue, you see a privacy issue, you may not be the experts in that, but just to know and have awareness about that, because at the end of the day, it's going to go into the product, and the customers do not see legal specialties. The customers see a product. Does it work for them? And do you have an opportunity with your leadership, your excitement, your creativity to bring all of those lawyers together, the legal disciplines, whether it be one lawyer with multiple hats on, or whether it be a 10 lawyer decision? At the end of the day, it's one product being offered to the customer. And so think about those adjacencies and how you can help build a strong business.
I love that, Adrienne. Thank you. Olga, you've talked about leverage and really not letting others define you. I think it's funny that you said just a lawyer because there's nothing about you that's just. And in all of the roles that you've worn, right, in all of the ways that you've shown up as a business partner and as a CEO, I wonder what really stands out in terms of leveraging the product counsel and the intellectual property to create a thriving business.
Yeah, yeah. I
The
actually,
roadmap. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So many things. I like to build a little bit because I like being very practical and tactical. I want to make sure folks get things that are useful and they implement on the day one. I think this idea that Adrienne just mentioned, asking better questions. The default for IP lawyers to ask, what can we protect? Remember, this is not a juicy question that will get attention. There's a better way to ask that question. For example, what gives this product its edge? How can we build a moat around this business? Use the word moat or edge, you're going to have a better conversation with your business just by definition. Again, use few words, use the words that grab attention and keep that attention where it should be. I think words are very powerful. I like to point out to lawyers that we become lawyers because we love words and because we're so good at it. So why not use it as a skill more intentionally? I think intellectual property is absolutely a tool that you can make much more visible. Salespeople love talking to prospects, mentioning patentable inventions and how useful they are. You don't have to overdo it, but educating your sales about what's protected and how you bring value is maybe important because remember, in the business, what's invisible is not valued. I know it's a little bit hard to hear because we as lawyers do things in the background. We don't, we know inherently when law is a center stage, that's not a good news for the company, right? When lawyers become important. But that is not to say that the value you create should be invisible. It's a very different statement, right? There's a difference between Olga being involved in handling everything through litigation, not a good time, and Olga creating assets that are sellable. Creating assets is an inherently legal event and inherently related to what intellectual property lawyers do. Remember, you can focus on the intellectual piece of it or the property piece of it. And however you do, that will be the outcome of your conversation. So those are maybe the two practical tips I would share.
That brings me back to trust, Adrienne. How do you make yourself an asset to the organization? How do you make yourself essential? How do you keep yourself from being invisible through this foundation of trust?
Yeah, I was trying to think about like if I had to give somebody like here's a cheat sheet of all the tips, and we do a little bit of this in the book, but um, I think there are a few things that have helped. One is, as we talked about before, integrate into the product lifecycle. If they know you're there early on, they would much rather talk to you in the early days than at the end. Um, again, the last thing that they want to do is to roll back a launch. So integrate into the product lifecycle. The second thing I would do is a little bit of the things we've talked about today, which is um, really adjust the mindset to be focused on driving the business and practice having a whole day where you don't use the word risk or legal risk, because at the end of the day, 98% of legal risk is about business impact. And ask yourself, what business impact will this have if we have to, if we have if we're getting investigated by a regulator? Um, will you have, will that have a business impact? You bet. Let me tell you why. If you do something that customers don't trust, what will happen? Well, they're going to abandon your product. They're going to talk smack about you on social media, and they're not going to buy it. Oh, okay. My CEO Olga friend here says, I don't like any of that. Tell me how to avoid that. So think about like, what can you do to drive the business? And then the third thing that I would share is really taking practical risk. So again, everyone, we're really good. We're all lawyers. We know how to identify risk all day long. We can give you a list of risks all day long. We think about risk. We know it when we see it. But we're not very good about, and it took me years to get better at it, was to really get crisp about the likelihood of the risks. How likely is this really to come about? Do the regulators really care about this? What has happened in similar case law? Are you a teeny tiny company that nobody cares about? Get really crisp about what the likelihood is. And then the other side of that, of course, is what can you do to mitigate it? Give your CEOs, give your chief product officers, give your co-founder an option. We can do this thing. It is possible that it will have business impact. It's possible that we might get fined. Here's some money for that. It's possible that we have to take it down, but we'll have notice about it and we'll be able to do that. And this is what the mitigation plan could look like. So thinking about not just listing the risks out, but getting really crisp about it. And kind of tying this to a comment Olga said earlier, if you at least try those kind of those three tips, and you become an essential part of the team, like the greatest compliment that I've ever had, and I've had it more than once, is when I'm in a meeting. It could be a meeting of 5 or a meeting of 30. And people say to me, like after the meeting, they didn't realize I was a lawyer. Like I love my JD and I love my experience as a lawyer, and I'm known for being like a lawyer. But to get through a really hard meeting where you're making critical business decisions, and your voice is translated into real business impact and figuring out how we're going to take care of the customer and how we're going to drive the business in a way that makes sense under the law. And someone says to you, oh, I didn't know you were a lawyer. How great is that?
That's fantastic. You used your words, actions, body language to create this trusting space, this vulnerability where they could see you as part of the conversation, where you showed them, demonstrated through your words and actions that you were aligned for the business impact. I love everything you just said, Adrienne. I have just two questions left. If there is a final final question from the audience. I can try to take it. But Olga, I'd love to hear what is important about this book now in the emergence of technologies like leveraging agentic AI. There's that word again, leveraging agentic AI and the changing business models that we're seeing. Everything's changing so quickly.
Yeah, that's actually the key realization. I remember when I was transitioning from law firm to in-house, and I interviewed for in-house jobs, and everybody asked me if I'm a SaaS lawyer. I found it a little sort of annoying at some point. I was silent for many interviews, and at some point I said SaaS is not in discipline in law. But what I invite you to reflect is that SaaS is a business model. And we actually, this been a, now it's a fairly established business model where risks are pretty well understood. Many of us navigate them intuitively because we've seen this movie for the last, few decades. And in the last, let's just say 7 years, somewhere between 10 and 5, we have been seeing supplementing of SaaS with AI, not necessarily LLMs, but kind of more traditional machine learning. And then over time, kind of LLMs. And we're now transitioning to what you described as agentic AI, and there are many flavors of that. And I think what it's important to pause here and realize that what's shifting is more than technology. It's kind of the same as, a few decades. Oh, is Olga a SaaS lawyer? Is Olga AI lawyer? That's the same question, just different point in time. What may be changing is a business model. And we kind of see business models are getting sort of weirder and faster. We have this open source AI model, decentralized tech, data monetization, really interesting, intriguing, scary things if you're a lawyer, usage-based pricing. Like I can go on for a very, very long time. And so what I invite folks to realize is that this is where your intellectual property skills are very useful. What's changing is our business models. Your skills can transform to a different technology. You can be very helpful today thinking through all of those interesting things that I just mentioned and gazillion that I haven't, because 10 years from now, you'll be living the unraveling of the choices someone or you made at this time. And at some point, the risks of agentic AI, if that becomes a business model, will become known. And we're going to look back and say, oh, Olga made enlightened choices that helped to propel business forward and made it the 7% that did better. Or Olga actually did not make really enlightened choices, and that's why we're no longer around, or didn't take this as an opportunity to do better, right? So and that's what I invite you to do. I invite you to reflect that new business models really require thinking part of it and predicting part of it, and kind of going where things are going and trying to nudge the business leverage into a better situation than you found the company in. And I think this is where a lawyer can really add a lot of value, especially a lawyer who understands technology, especially a lawyer that understands business. And I am assuming that everyone who graduated from law school and became a member of a bar understands law. That's just table stakes.
This has been such a thought-provoking conversation. I just want to pull out some of the highlights for me, which is language matters, revenue, leverage, business impact. Ask better questions. Don't let others define you. As Olivia called out, really, this role of product counsel, of IP lawyer is a psychologist and really understanding the change that is happening. It is going to happen around you, so you can either be part of it or you can be part of that 20% that doesn't evolve with the business. And I'd like to just ask one final question in our last minute here, if you can each give a very short answer as we wrap up. Is there one action item that leaders can take to gain strategic influence?
I would say speak the language of the business.
Yeah, I would say outcomes. Aim for outcomes, not just options.
I love that. Well, thank you both so much. This has been fantastic. Really appreciate you. I'm excited for this book and all that it offers. If you're joining us here, please check out the Next Gen Summit, which is coming up on May 1st in Redwood City. More great conversations, and appreciate you. Thanks so much.
Bye, everyone.